It's Wednesday, the sun sets in the west, and Kathleen Kennedy had something stupid to say. I guess all is right with the world. Kennedy's recent interview in Rolling Stone magazine was chock full of silly, absurd comments and attempts to make her job look more difficult than it actually is. She doesn't seem to realize that she's only a Hollywood producer and that people have been making movies for over a century now. The nut has been cracked. Yeah, I'm far from the first person to point out my annoyance with her comments in this article. But from my perspective, everyone is getting up in arms over the wrong issue, most of which stem from her first response. The common question was her remark about Star Wars source material. She laments the lack of novels and comic books available to lift ideas from when working on these new Star Wars movies. She claims this makes it difficult to create new movies. The general consensus seems to be it was Disney who decided to eschew the expanded universe, which is exactly the type of material she would have access to if not for the decision of her bosses. So the material she talks about not being able to rely on to make new movies does, in fact, exist. So that's a fair criticism, but only a surface one. She doesn't seem to realize she works for a multi-million-dollar movie production studio, and that her job isn't to simply adapt source material to film, but to create original content, or more accurately, to foster the ability of those more capable than herself to create original content. What? Does she think George Lucas simply adapted Star Wars from a comic book or a novel? He took inspiration from the works of others that came before him, sure, but he created something unique. He was a storyteller, and so he told stories, his own stories in his own voice. He didn't need the expanded universe to do that. He created everything he needed to tell his own stories. He was just so good at it that others built on the foundation he laid. Kennedy's job is, or should be, to acquire the talents of storytellers and to allow them to tell stories, their own stories in their own voices. It's not to hire hacks to cobble together retreads of older works, which seems to be what she believes her job is. They should be laying new foundations, not retreading old material. This logic is why we got The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, both retreads of George Lucas's A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, respectively. Rian Johnson has admitted to being a bad writer.
I write sporadically and badly with no rhyme or reason whatsoever. I don't think I could ever actually write for a living, like write for hire, because I take so long to write, and I just it's bad, man. It's no good.
So why did Kennedy hire him to write a movie? Her job is to put the right people into the right places. She clearly failed on this one, but it seems she failed because she doesn't understand her own job. I hope that Kennedy takes her leave from the Star Wars helm after the release of The Rise of Skywalker. If the studio's output under her direction wasn't enough to raise your concern, then her statements in this article must have pushed you over the edge. She goes on to say things like she still doesn't think she has a handle on The Rise of Skywalker only 1 month out from its release, that Rian Johnson is an extraordinary filmmaker, and that The Last Jedi was a wonderful film. I know it would be highly unusual for her to trash either, but she didn't have to be so effusive with praise that is so obviously unwarranted. She also states that there are no plans set in stone for any future Star Wars movies. Disney spent $4 billion for the rights to Star Wars in 2012. That was 7 years ago. It seems like Disney would have some sense of an idea of what they wanted to do with their $14 billion investment by now. Why don't they? Well, and I quote, "We want to take plenty of time and plenty of conversation and careful thought before deciding exactly what we're going to do." So, what exactly have they spent the last 7 years doing? She claims that Marvel's Kevin Feige, who has been announced to have a Star Wars project in the works, came to them and asked for that project. So we're supposed to believe that the man in charge of the most financially successful film franchise in the history of film, one that's beloved by fans and critics alike, went out of his way and asked to work for Disney's Star Wars? Just think about that for a second. She goes on to say that her and Lucas are still friends, and while that may be true, I wouldn't remain friends with someone who did me as dirty as she did him. I seem to recall Lucas referring to Disney as white slavers. I've never referred to a friend that way. But at least she was honest about Lucas's unwillingness to return to Star Wars, even if the reason she cites is obvious misdirection. Lucas was devastated by the fan reaction to the sequel trilogy, and felt betrayed by people he thought were his friends, Kennedy being chief among them, during the Disney Star Wars era. Him being busy with the Museum of Narrative Art isn't the reason he doesn't want to come back to Star Wars. This interview would have been a laugh riot if not for the current state of Star Wars. We're only weeks out from the final movie in the Skywalker saga, and it's not even completed. Half of the Star Wars community, some of them fans since 1977, are less than eager for its conclusion, and the franchise itself remains directionless as talent jumps ship for greener pastures. Since Kennedy took the helm, the fan base has been divided. The movies have been uninspired, and identity politics has been placed above story and plot. Hopefully, this is the last time we have to hear from Kathleen Kennedy, at least as the head of Disney Star Wars. Her departure can't come soon enough, though the damage she has done to the franchise and its fandom is likely irreparable.